The dinner at Rothmere House had been planned for 6 weeks. 24 guests, 5 courses, the best china, the family silver that had been polished for 2 days by the under-housemaid, and the particular kind of arrangement that the Duchess of Rothmere, Henry's mother, Eugenia, considered essential for any dinner at which something significant was to be announced. The roses on the table were white, the candles were wax of the highest grade, imported from France, and at precisely the moment between the fish course and the venison, when the conversation had reached the comfortable hum of well-fed people who were beginning to anticipate dessert, Henry Rothmere, His Grace, the Duke of Rothmere, 29 years old, in possession of 3 estates and a parliamentary seat, and the kind of face that had been carved into miniatures by hopeful mothers across half of England, stood up at the head of the table and tapped his crystal glass with his butter knife. The room went quiet. He cleared his throat. He smiled the careful, prepared smile of a man who had practiced this announcement in front of his looking-glass 3 times that morning. "I have an announcement to make," he said, "or rather, an engagement to share with all of you who are most dear to me." 23 faces turned toward him with varying degrees of polite interest. 23 because the 24th person, seated near the middle of the long table on the left side, was Lady Sophia Calderwood, who had been Henry's intended for nearly a year. She was 23 years old. She was beautiful in the careful, well-bred manner of a woman who had been groomed since girlhood for exactly the kind of marriage she was about to enter. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had been made for her by Madame Devereux, specifically for tonight. Her hair was dressed in pearls, and she was looking at Henry with the expression of a woman who knew with absolute certainty that she was about to be the subject of his announcement. She was correct in her certainty. She was also incorrect in her assumption that it would be the announcement she expected. The understanding between Lady Sophia Calderwood and Henry Rothmere had been arranged the previous Christmas, during a long conversation between her father and his mother in the library at Calderwood Hall. Sophia had not been present for that conversation. She had been informed of its conclusions afterward, which was the conventional manner of such things. The Earl of Calderwood had explained to his daughter that an alliance with the Rothmere family would be of considerable mutual benefit. The Calderwoods possessed an old title and considerable land, but had been cash poor for 2 generations, while the Rothmeres possessed enormous wealth and political influence, but were, in Henry's case, reaching the age at which a duke without a wife began to attract uncomfortable speculation. The arrangement was, by the standards of their class, entirely reasonable. Sophia had accepted it with the composure she had been trained to deploy. She had liked Henry, in the way that one liked a man one had been told one would marry. She had liked his height and his manners, and the way he could discuss horse breeding with her father for 40 minutes without growing tired. She had not loved him. She had not expected to love him. Love, her mother had explained when Sophia was 16 and had asked about it with the romantic curiosity of a girl who had read too many novels, was something that grew in marriages between sensible people. It was not a prerequisite, it was a result. Sophia had accepted this. She had accepted Henry's courtship over the past year with the same composure with which she had accepted the arrangement itself. She had attended dinners with him, she had walked in gardens with him, she had allowed him to take her hand in carriages and sit beside her at musicales, and she had observed him with the careful, evaluative attention of a woman who was attempting to determine, before the wedding, whether the man she was about to marry was one she could spend 40 years with. She had concluded by January that he was. He was steady, she thought. He was kind, in the absent-minded way that men of his station were sometimes kind. He was, perhaps, not the most attentive suitor she had encountered, but attentiveness was a quality of new courtships and rarely survived into marriage. She had been prepared. She had been settled. And she had believed, until approximately 90 seconds ago, that she understood the man she was going to marry. The announcement, when Henry made it, did not so much shatter that understanding as reveal that the understanding had never existed. The man she had spent a year learning to be married to had been, for the past 3 months, writing daily letters to another woman. The understanding had been, on his side, theatrical. A performance maintained for the convenience of his mother and the obligations of his name, while his actual interests pursued an entirely different woman in an entirely different drawing room. Sophia had not seen any of it. She had not suspected any of it. She had attended dinners with him while his thoughts had been elsewhere, and she had not noticed because she had been trained to evaluate men by their public conduct rather than their private affections, and his public conduct had been impeccable. Now, sitting at his mother's dining table while he announced that he was going to marry someone else, Sophia understood with the cold, absolute clarity of a woman who has just realized she has been a fool that the only person at this table who had not known what was about to happen was herself. "It is my great pleasure," Henry said, his voice carrying easily across the dining room, "to inform you that I am to be married to Miss Caroline Whitfield." 23 faces processed this information at varying speeds. Some, the older guests who had not been following the season's gossip closely, simply registered the name and offered the polite smiles of people who had been prepared to applaud whatever announcement was made. Others, the younger and more socially attentive guests, registered the name and immediately began to recalculate. Caroline Whitfield was not Sophia Calderwood. Caroline Whitfield was in fact a young woman of decidedly modest pedigree. Her father was a country physician with a respectable but unremarkable practice in Hertfordshire. Her mother was the daughter of a clergyman, and her own social standing was almost entirely the result of her godmother, an elderly viscountess who had taken Caroline under her wing for the season and had introduced her at Almack's twice. Sophia Calderwood was the daughter of an earl. Caroline Whitfield was the goddaughter of a viscountess. The mathematics of the substitution did not, by any conventional measure of London society, balance, and the silence that fell across the dining room at Rothmere House was the silence of 22 people simultaneously realizing that the woman seated at the table, the woman who had been Henry's intended for almost a year, the woman whose engagement to him had been an open secret since Easter, was not, in fact, the woman he had just announced he was going to marry. The 23rd person, the Duchess of Rothmere, was not silent. She was, however, motionless. She sat at the foot of the table with her wineglass halfway to her lips, and her face arranged in the careful frozen expression of a woman who had not been informed of this development and was attempting, with considerable effort, to appear as though she had been. Henry, who had not noticed his mother's expression because he was looking determinedly at a point on the far wall just above the mantelpiece, continued, "Miss Whitfield is, as some of you may know, currently a guest of Lady Aldridge for the season. She is also, as fewer of you may know, the woman to whom I have been writing every day for the past 3 months, and whose acceptance of my proposal yesterday afternoon constitutes the happiest event of my life." A pause. "I had hoped to share this news with all of you in a more leisurely manner, but circumstances have required that I make the announcement tonight in the presence of those whose opinions matter most to me. I trust you will join me in offering my congratulations to Miss Whitfield, who unfortunately could not be here this evening as the news is so recent that she has not yet informed her own family." Sophia Calderwood set down her fork. She set it down carefully, with the precision of a woman who had been raised never to make sudden movements at table. She placed it on the edge of her plate, exactly parallel to her knife, and then she folded her hands in her lap. She did not look at Henry. She did not look at Henry's mother, whose face had gone the color of unblanched almond. She did not look at her own father, the Earl of Calderwood, who was seated 3 places to her left and whose expression was beginning the slow transition from bewildered politeness to dawning fury. She looked at her wineglass. She picked it up. She took a sip. She set it back down. And then, in a voice that carried across the dining room, with the same effortless authority Henry's had managed, but with considerably more steel beneath it, she said, "How extraordinary." The dining room, which had been silent in the way that rooms become silent when something has gone deeply and visibly wrong, became silent in a different way. The way rooms become silent when something is about to become considerably worse. "Lady Sophia," Henry began. He had finally noticed her. He had finally perhaps registered the extraordinary breach he had just committed, announcing his engagement to a different woman in the presence of the woman who had been understood by every member of London society who had eyes to be his intended. His face went through several rapid adjustments, confusion, embarrassment, something that might have been, very briefly, the panic of a man who has just realized that the careful private decision he made yesterday has now become a public catastrophe of considerable magnitude. Lady Sophia, I had hoped to speak with you privately. Yes, Sophia said. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. I imagine you did. Tell me, Your Grace, when did you intend to do so? Before the venison or after? Henry's mother made a small sound. It was not quite a gasp. It was the sound of a woman who has spent 30 years managing her son's social engagements with iron precision, and who is now watching him publicly destroy a betrothal that she had spent 18 months arranging, and who is realizing that she will need to manage the consequences of this evening for the next decade. Lady Sophia, Henry said again, I owe you? An apology, Sophia suggested. An explanation? A formal withdrawal of the understanding that has existed between our families since last Christmas? She tilted her head slightly. The pearls in her hair caught the candlelight. I find I am not certain which I would prefer to receive first, Your Grace. Perhaps you might choose. The Earl of Calderwood, Sophia's father, finally found his voice. Rothmere, he said, and the single word landed like a stone dropped into still water. What is the meaning of this? Henry looked at Sophia's father. He looked at his own mother. He looked at the 20 other guests who were all, to varying degrees, attempting to appear as though they were not witnessing the most spectacular social catastrophe of the season. And he made the second worst decision of the evening, which was to attempt to explain himself in front of all of them. Lord Calderwood, Henry said, I have the greatest respect for your daughter. The understanding between our families was, as you know, one of mutual benefit and family tradition. But I have come to realize, over the past several months, that I cannot enter into a marriage that is not founded on the deepest affection. Miss Whitfield is the woman I love. I cannot in good conscience marry your daughter while loving another. A silence. Sophia Calderwood looked at her wineglass again. She looked at the rim of it, at the faint smear of her lip rouge on the crystal, and then she looked, finally, at Henry. Your Grace, she said, and her voice was so calm, so perfectly modulated, that it could have been mistaken for friendliness if one were not paying attention. I find myself with 2 observations and 1 question. May I share them? Henry, who looked like a man who had realized halfway through a duel that he had brought the wrong sword, nodded. My first observation, Sophia said, is that you have just informed 23 people, including my father, that you have been writing daily letters to another woman for 3 months while engaged to me. You have done this in front of guests who will, by tomorrow morning, have ensured that this information reaches every drawing room in London. She paused. My second observation is that you have done this without first informing me, which is to say, without first granting me the dignity of ending our engagement in private. You have instead made me the subject of public spectacle, which I assume was not your intention, but which is, regardless, the result. Another pause. My question is this. Did Miss Whitfield know, when she accepted your proposal yesterday afternoon, that you were still engaged to me? Henry's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. He looked in that moment like a man who was understanding several things simultaneously and was finding none of them reassuring. He began. Yes or no, Your Grace, Sophia said. Her voice was still pleasant. I find I prefer simple answers when possible. Henry's silence was its own answer. The dining room registered it. Sophia's father registered it. Henry's mother, whose face had progressed from unblanched almond to the white of fine porcelain, registered it most acutely of all. I see, Sophia said. She set her napkin on the table. She did not throw it. She did not crumple it. She simply placed it beside her plate with the same careful precision with which she had arranged her fork. Then I find I have 1 more observation. Miss Whitfield, if she accepted you knowing of our engagement, is not a woman of honor. If she accepted you not knowing, then she is a woman who has been deceived, and she will discover this deception within the week, at which point she will be required to make her own decisions about the kind of man she has agreed to marry. In neither case is the situation one I wish to remain in the presence of. She stood. The whole dining room watched her stand. She was 23 years old. She was wearing ivory silk and pearls, and she stood with the absolute composure of a woman who had been raised, from the moment she could understand language, to navigate exactly this kind of situation, except that the situations she had been raised to navigate had not generally, included being publicly jilted by a duke at his own dinner table. "Father," Sophia said, looking at the Earl of Calderwood, "I believe I will not be staying for the venison. I find I have lost my appetite. I trust you will offer my apologies to Her Grace for departing before the conclusion of the meal." The Earl of Calderwood was not a man known for his eloquence. He was a man known for his temper, his hounds, and his investments in coal mining. But in that moment, he looked at his daughter, at her perfect composure, at her ivory silk, at the careful way she was holding herself together while every person in the room watched her humiliation. And he said very simply, "I will accompany you, my dear." "There is no need." "There is every need." He stood as well. He turned to the Duchess of Rothmere, who had still not moved. "Eugenia, I trust you will excuse us. The arrangements between our families will, of course, be discussed by our solicitors. I expect you will be hearing from mine within the week." The Duchess of Rothmere closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked at her son with an expression that suggested she was already mentally composing the conversation she would have with him after the guests departed, and that the conversation would not be brief. "Of course," she said. "I quite understand." Sophia walked out of the dining room. She did not look at Henry. She did not look at the other guests. She walked the length of the long room, with her head high and her shoulders back. And when she reached the door, her father was beside her, and they walked out together into the entrance hall, where the footman, who had been standing at his post for the past hour with no expectation whatever of being required to fetch their cloaks before dessert, scrambled to compose himself. The cloaks were retrieved. Sophia put hers on. Her father put his on. They walked out the front door of Rothmere House and into the cold March evening, and the door closed behind them with the soft, expensive click of a door that had been hung by craftsmen and maintained by servants, and had never, in its 80 years of service to the Rothmere family, closed behind a more dramatic exit. In the dining room, the silence held for approximately 4 seconds after the front door clicked shut. Then it shattered. Conversations erupted in fragments. Several of the guests began the elaborate performance of pretending nothing had happened, asking neighbors about the weather and the Easter assemblies in tones of strained brightness. 2 of the women near the far end of the table began whispering to each other with the kind of urgent intensity that suggested the gossip would be in print by way of various drawing rooms by Wednesday. The Duchess of Rothmere stood up. She did not speak to her son. She did not speak to the guests. She walked the length of the dining room, opened the door to the small private parlor adjacent to it, and gestured. Henry, after a long moment in which he appeared to consider whether he might possibly remain at his own dining table, stood up and followed her. The door closed. The remaining guests were left to negotiate the venison course among themselves, and in that small private parlor, the Duchess of Rothmere, who was 61 years old and who had outlived 2 husbands and managed the affairs of 4 estates, and survived 3 minor scandals during her own youth, looked at her only son and said with the precision of a woman who had been holding herself together by sheer force of will for the past quarter of an hour, "Henry, sit down. I'm about to ask you several questions, and the answers had better be the truth, or I will personally write to Miss Whitfield's godmother tonight and inform her that she has just attached her goddaughter to a man who has demonstrated in front of 23 witnesses that his word is not reliable." Henry sat down. The conversation that followed lasted 43 minutes. By the end of it, the Duchess of Rothmere had extracted from her son the entire chronology of his courtship of Caroline Whitfield, which had begun in early January at a musical at Lady Aldridge's house, had progressed through a series of carefully managed encounters at the homes of mutual acquaintances, had escalated to the daily letters Henry had mentioned, and had culminated in his proposal yesterday afternoon at a private interview in Lady Aldridge's drawing room. She had also extracted the information that Caroline Whitfield had, in fact, known about the engagement to Sophia Calderwood. She had known about it from the beginning. She had known about it because Henry had, in a moment of romantic ardor in February, written to Caroline that he intended to break the engagement to Lady Sophia because his heart belonged to her. Caroline had encouraged this. Caroline had, indeed, suggested that Henry break the engagement publicly rather than privately, because, and here the Duchess of Rothmere had to ask Henry to repeat the explanation twice before she could fully process it, Caroline believed that a public break would force Henry to commit to her in a way that a private one would not. The Duchess of Rothmere sat very still for several seconds after this revelation. Then she said, "Henry?" "Yes, Mama." "I want you to listen very carefully to what I am about to say." "Yes, Mama." "Miss Whitfield has not chosen you because she loves you. Miss Whitfield has chosen you because she has, with considerable strategic intelligence, identified a path by which a young woman of modest connections might marry a duke. She has manipulated you into doing the public part of the work for her, because a private breaking of the engagement would have given Sophia's family the opportunity to manage the scandal and contain the damage. A public breaking, in contrast, ensures that you cannot retreat. You are now, as of 45 minutes ago, a man who has very publicly humiliated the daughter of an earl. You have no path back. You will marry Miss Whitfield, because if you do not, the entire weight of London society will descend on you, and you will become not merely a man who jilted a woman, but a man who jilted two women, which is a category of social catastrophe from which no recovery is possible." A silence. Henry looked at his mother. He looked at her with the slow, dawning expression of a man who was beginning to understand, several hours too late, that he had been managed, not by his mother, not by Sophia, by Caroline Whitfield, the country physician's daughter who had identified, with the precision of a chess player, exactly which piece needed to be moved in order to checkmate her opponent. "Mama," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "what have I done?" "You have," his mother said, "married yourself to a woman of considerable intelligence and limited scruples, who will spend the next 40 years either making you very happy or making you very miserable, depending on whether her interests align with yours. I would suggest, going forward, that you make your interests align with hers." She stood. "Now, we will return to the dining room, we will finish the venison, we will smile at the guests, and tomorrow morning we will begin the work of containing this evening's damage, which will require considerable effort and not a small amount of money. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mama." "Henry?" "Yes?" "Lady Sophia will not be your friend in this, but I will write to her tomorrow, and I will apologize on your behalf, and I will offer her family whatever I can offer to soften the blow. You will not contact her, you will not write to her, you will not, under any circumstances, attempt to explain yourself. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mama." "Good. Get up." They returned to the dining room. The venison was served. The conversation resumed at a slightly higher pitch than was strictly comfortable, and no one mentioned, for the rest of the evening, the empty chair where Lady Sophia Calderwood had been seated. 6 weeks later, Henry Rothmere married Caroline Whitfield in a private ceremony at the Whitfield family parish in Hertfordshire. The wedding was small. It was attended by Caroline's parents, her godmother, and 3 of Henry's reluctant relatives, none of whom included his mother, who had developed a convenient indisposition that prevented her from making the journey. The London papers covered the event with the kind of brisk neutrality that suggested they had been instructed not to embellish. Lady Sophia Calderwood, meanwhile, did not retire to the country. She did not go into seclusion. She did not, despite the urging of her mother and several well-meaning aunts, take an extended holiday on the continent until the scandal had blown over. She remained in London. She attended the next ball she had been invited to, which was at Lady Aldridge's house, and which Caroline Whitfield had been expected to attend until her elopement to Hertfordshire made the attendance impossible. Sophia walked into Lady Aldridge's ballroom in a gown of pale gold silk that her dressmaker had completed in 3 days at considerable additional cost, and she stood at the entrance and waited for the room to register her presence. The room registered her presence. The conversations faltered, the whispers rose, and Sophia Calderwood, who had spent the past 6 weeks reading every cutting and patronizing comment that had been made about her in print and in private, who had been pitied and analyzed and discussed by every woman in London with the time and the inclination, walked into that ballroom with her chin up and her shoulders back, and the absolute certainty that she would not give anyone in that room the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She danced. Not alone. She had been quietly approached by 3 different gentlemen before she had even handed off her cloak, all of them eager to demonstrate that they did not consider her presence in the ballroom to be diminished by Henry Rothmere's defection. She danced with a viscount. She danced with the younger son of a marquis. She danced with a quiet, serious man named Lord Ashworth, who was newly returned from the peninsula with a slight limp and a reputation for honesty that was the talk of the season among the women who appreciated such things. Lord Ashworth did not mention Henry. He did not mention Caroline. He did not, in any way, treat Sophia as the recently jilted ex-fiancée of the Duke of Rothmere. He treated her instead as a young woman with whom he was dancing, asking her about her family, her interests, the books she'd been reading. By the end of their second dance, Sophia had laughed twice. Both times Lord Ashworth had looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to make her laugh and who had filed the information away as something significant. 3 months later, Lord Ashworth, whose Christian name was Edward, who was 32 years old, who had inherited a modest estate in Kent from his elder brother's death 2 years earlier, and who had been considered by the marriage market a quiet, unremarkable prospect because of his limp and his reluctance to attend more than the absolute minimum of social events, called on Lady Sophia at her father's house and asked the Earl of Calderwood for permission to court her. He did not arrive with flowers. He did not arrive with a carefully prepared speech. He arrived with a small, leather-bound volume of poetry that he had noticed Sophia admiring at a bookshop the previous week, and he gave it to her with the quiet observation that he hoped she had not already purchased a copy. She had not. She accepted the book and the courtship together. The Earl of Calderwood, who had been watching his daughter carefully since the Rothmere disaster, and who had developed in those months an intense skepticism about the entire institution of betrothal, interviewed Lord Ashworth privately for an hour before consenting. He emerged from the interview looking thoughtful. "He is not what I expected," the Earl said to his wife afterward. "He answered every question directly. He did not flatter me. He told me when I asked that he was not a wealthy man, and that he could not offer Sophia the establishment Rothmere could have offered. He said he believed she had had enough of establishments and might prefer something quieter." The Earl had paused. "I think we have been wrong, all this while, about what kind of marriage might suit her." Sophia said yes the day Edward asked her. She did not require a long deliberation. She had spent 6 months observing him in ballrooms and at musicales and at the small dinner parties to which her family had begun inviting him with strategic frequency, and she had concluded that Edward Ashworth was the first man she had encountered in her adult life who looked at her and saw an actual person rather than an alliance, a connection, or a prize. He had read the books she had read. He disagreed with her sometimes on questions of poetry and politics, and the disagreements were genuine rather than performed. He listened when she spoke. He remembered what she had said to him 3 weeks earlier and referenced it casually in subsequent conversation, which suggested that he had been paying attention, not because he was attempting to court her, but because he was actually interested in what she thought. Edward Ashworth, who was steady where Henry Rothmere had been impulsive, who was honest where Henry had been calculating, who was present where Henry had been performing, courted Lady Sophia Calderwood for 6 months. They were married in October at the Earl of Calderwood's country estate. The wedding was small. Henry Rothmere was not invited. The Duchess of Rothmere, who had been corresponding with Sophia's mother for the past several months, in an attempt to repair what she could of the relationship between the families, sent a magnificent silver tea service and a letter expressing her sincere joy at Sophia's happiness, which Sophia read carefully and then placed in her writing desk and never mentioned again. Henry Rothmere's marriage to Caroline did not, despite his mother's predictions, become miserable. It did not become happy either. It became something in between, a careful, mutually beneficial arrangement in which Caroline managed the household and the social calendar with the strategic precision she had once applied to managing Henry's heart, and Henry attended Parliament and oversaw the estates and accepted gradually that the woman he had married was a woman of formidable competence whose interests had aligned with his own through her efforts rather than his. They had 3 children. Caroline became a duchess of considerable influence. Henry remained throughout his life a man who had the slightly bewildered expression of someone who could not quite remember how he had arrived at his current circumstances. Sophia and Edward Ashworth had 4 children. They lived primarily at Edward's estate in Kent, where Sophia discovered that she had a gift for managing a working farm and where Edward built her a small library overlooking the orchard. She did not return to London for full seasons. She visited occasionally, attended the ceremonies that required her presence, and then went home. Once, 8 years after the dinner at Rothmere House, she encountered Caroline Rothmere at a charity event at the British Museum. Caroline was beautiful in the way she had always been, careful, polished, perfectly maintained. Sophia was wearing a green velvet dress that was 3 years out of fashion and had a small jam stain on the cuff from breakfast with her youngest son. They looked at each other across a crowd of fashionable people, and Caroline gave Sophia a small, careful nod. Sophia returned it with a smile that contained no malice and no triumph and very little interest. Then she turned to her husband, who was beside her, and said something that made him laugh, and they walked away together into the next room. Caroline Rothmere stood very still for a long moment after they left. Then she returned to her conversation with the wife of a cabinet minister, and her voice was perfectly modulated, and her smile was perfectly arranged, and only her hands, gripping the edge of her reticule a little too tightly, suggested that she had just registered something she had been carefully avoiding registering for 8 years, which was that the woman whose engagement she had stolen had not, in any meaningful sense, lost. The wrong woman, it turned out, had stayed at the dinner table. The right one had walked out the door and into a life that did not require her to perform anything at all. And on the long ride home in the carriage, with her husband beside her, and the spring countryside passing by the windows in its slow, ordinary green, Sophia Ashworth thought about that dinner, the white roses, the candles, the moment between the fish course and the venison, and she felt, not satisfaction, not vindication, but something quieter and more useful. She felt grateful. To Henry, who had freed her, to Caroline, who had made the freeing inevitable, and to herself for having had the dignity that night to set down her napkin and walk out the door before the venison was served. Some doors, she had learned, were better walked through than kept closed, and some announcements, however cruelly delivered, turned out to be the beginning of a far better story than the one being announced.